Friendly UAV inbound.
The idea of drones in War Thunder, both for reconnaissance and for potentially direct combat, is something I remember bringing up over 4 years ago. Not really sure it would ever be a viable option, but nonetheless finding it an interesting brainstorm. Then, last year, we obviously got our first taste of drones in the April Fool's Warfare 2077 event, with both a stealth-like attack drone and a small vehicle-launched recon drone. Well, the other day, Gaijin released a teaser ahead of the next War Thunder update, supposedly taken from the perspective of a drone, and showing some French Mirage aircraft on a runway. And while initially I thought perhaps this was actually shot from the perspective of a helicopter just for the sake of a cool shot, Gaijin have now released a devblog for the first iteration of drones in War Thunder. Now this is big news. In my opinion, this will be the most significant addition or change to the way ground RB games are played that we've seen in years, certainly since the introduction of thermal optics, and possibly on par with the introduction of stabilizers in 2017. By the way, obviously we're 99% sure that these aircraft in the teaser are Mirage 2000s, France's Generation 4 fighter jet, and basically the closest thing Western Europe has to the MiG-29, though that isn't yet confirmed, and it's possible that they could be Mirage 50s. This is an aircraft that could make a good Rank 6 premium, more akin to the F5C or A5C above the Milan, or squadron/event vehicle like the Su-22 M3, F4F Early, or Kafir C2. Like I said, I'm fairly certain they are Mirage 2000s, which definitely wouldn't be surprising. That is definitely the level we're up to, but just something to think about. The main topic of today, however, is of course the new drones, how they're being introduced, why they're being introduced, and what their future and their effects on the game as a whole will be. I have several questions I want to raise that I can't really give a complete overall opinion without knowing the answers to. The devblog unfortunately gave little information, and I'm still waiting to hear back from my contacts at Gaijin Entertainment. But for the most part, though my opinion is very positive on this, I have some real concerns. Before we start out, however, I think it's high time I give a proper thank you to those of you who've joined up with channel memberships. Obviously this channel does not have a Patreon anymore, but I do specifically want to call out that memberships have replaced that, and any more of you who do wish to support the channel can join up there's a button down below. We have a $2 tier and a $5 tier with rewards and member benefits to match, and we'll also be putting all members in a credits section in our videos here from now on, so I would love to have some more of you to shout out. We also have a new line of merch out on our store, The Armory, with some very cool designs and more coming soon, so go check that out if you're interested. Lastly, if you're considering picking up any premiums or pre-orders, like the new Spanish Centauro, or even just some Golden Eagles or anything, be sure to use our affiliate link below. It nets you a small discount, helps out the channel, and the first time you use it, you'll even get our decal to use on all your vehicles in-game. Anyway, I think that's enough shelling out for one day. Let's get into this. So the as of yet unnamed update, at least as far as I'm aware, is going to be providing players with two kinds of drones, or UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, that will work in two different ways. The first is a simple scout drone, represented here by the Russian Zala. These will function like the small recon UAV launched from the Harpy tank destroyer in last year's April Fools. They'll actually be available as a modification to all light tanks at rank 6 and 7, functioning as a consumable like artillery or fire extinguishers. As a light tank player, you'll be able to send one of these up while in your tank, the way you jump into aircraft in arcade mode, leaving your tank stationary while in the perspective of the drone. Though for the most part these aren't launched from vehicles, they are part of the equipment that the troops inside the vehicle can get out, assemble and launch and control while not in the tank itself. So I'm not sure exactly how that will work or how that'll look. Presumably they'll just appear in the air near your tank, but perhaps they'll actually have some kind of animation for setting up and taking off. Now, these scout UAVs will have the ability to scout targets just like a light tank can, and the rewards for scouting, I have had this confirmed, will be the same as if the light tank did it directly, which is huge. They also have a battery life, and while Gaijin says in the devblog that this is more than enough to last an entire game, it'll be interesting to see whether in custom battles that can last anywhere up to 6 hours, these UAVs have a historical maximum battery life. For example, the US RQ-11 Raven, which is a recon drone we may see, has a battery life of around 60 to 90 minutes, while the Israeli Orbiter can fly for up to 3 hours. Though it's worth keeping in mind that most others have batteries that last for many hours to an entire day of flight time. So it might be that Gaijin have just not included a battery life mechanic at all, since it would almost never matter. Kind of like having limited fuel for tanks, it just makes no sense to bother with. Now your drone will also be destroyed if your vehicle is destroyed while you're in it, which means that players will have to be really careful when using them, ensuring that their vehicle is in a safe location, and that the first thing they do is check the immediate surroundings to make sure no enemies are sneaking up on them while they can't defend themselves. The last thing we know for certain is that your light tanks will actually be able to reload their drones in friendly capture points. So while you only get one charge at a time and then the drone is gone if and when you crash it or it gets shot down, you can go to get more. This is something players have also wanted for FPE and potentially armor modules like ERA or the Leopard 2's Arrowhead turret pieces, so perhaps we'll see something of that like too. I certainly hope so. And as a side note, I feel like artillery could work in the same way as well, reloaded on a cap after a single available charge. But let me know what you think down in the comments. Of course, when it comes to reloading, for example, crew members on a friendly cap, you can only do it once. So perhaps the scout UAVs will work on that same way, we just don't know yet. So the first question I have is what the drone does when you're not actually using it. Say if you launch it and then want to switch back to your tank's view because you notice an enemy close by, will the drone continue to fly around, perhaps orbiting over the battlefield or over the nearby area around you, or will it just continue flying in a straight line wherever it was last being pointed? If they have some sort of autopilot that lets them orbit around you, will they have the logic to not fly into buildings on, say, Alaska, or rocks and mountains on, for example, Red Desert or Carpathians? If they simply fly straight, then you run into a problem, so you need to switch back to the light tank for a little while and then back again to the drone. It might be miles away from the battlefield, and most of these drones are really slow, some 100 kilometers per hour. That means you'll honestly be better off just crashing it into the ground and heading to the nearest friendly capture zone in your light tank to reload a new drone. Though I suppose if you have good timing, you might be able to turn it back around, switch to the tank again, and then switch back to the drone again just as it flies back over you to regain control. There's also a question worth asking about whether the scout UAVs will be limited to the tank battle area, getting the return to battle message with a 25-second timer before they self-destruct if they go outside it, or will they have the whole air battle zone like aircraft and helicopters do? Given the slow speed of these drones, they are not much faster than tanks, in fact slower than some of them, it might be best to have them limited to the tank battle area, but instead of being destroyed seconds after leaving it, they get turned around and respawned like aircraft do when they go outside the battle area in air battles. Speaking of which, these drones will all have damage models and realistic flight models just like regular aircraft, and though UAVs obviously can't be pilot sniped, I do wonder whether they'll be able to have their receiver and transmitter shot out, functioning the exact same way. Those available to rank 7 tanks will also have thermal optics as well, which potentially means 2 or more drones per nation. Some of them are also equipped with landing gear, which makes me wonder if they'll be able to capture zones the way helicopters can, which would mean that a legitimate strategy might be to block a cap by piloting a drone straight into it as the match begins. And even if the enemy team have someone do the same, neither of you can take that base until tanks arrive and shoot the enemy drones. If they can cap, then they will be incredibly powerful in the late game, and potentially incredibly annoying, particularly on maps where the spawns can't be shot into, like the north side of American Desert. The last question I have is whether players will get a reward for having shot down enemy UAVs, as if they were an aircraft, or perhaps half or a quarter the reward of a proper aircraft since, they're just consumable drones. At the same time, SPAA gain nothing for shooting down incoming munitions like Mavericks for example, and if they don't earn anything for shooting down the drones at all, I think that would be a real shame. On the other hand, if they do, expect to see a lot of shulkers this patch, and keep that in mind as a tactic to deny the airspace to enemy drones by way of early spawning SPAA. As for the scout drones themselves, as I said, we saw a Russian Zala drone in the devblog. Zala, by the way, is a whole family of drones. This one I believe is the 421-16E, which has a top speed of 150 km per hour. But I also expect to see the Israeli Orbiter, which looks very similar and performs very similarly, and potentially the Lockheed Martin Desert Hawk for Britain, which is slower at around 90 kph top speed. For America, there are a ton of options, like the RQ-2 Pioneer, which tops out at 185 kph, or the RQ-7 Shadow, which comes in at 200 and is also used by Italy and Sweden. And I think this is probably the most likely candidate for that reason. Then there's the RQ-11 Raven I mentioned earlier, which is a lot slower, only 80 kph, but is used again by Italy as well as the UK. And lastly, there's the RQ-20 Puma, also used by Sweden, the UK and Germany, with around the same top speed. What I expect is the Desert Hawk for Britain, that'll give them a nice unique option, the RQ-20 for Germany, the RQ-7 or RQ-11 for Italy, perhaps both, either the RQ-7 or RQ-20 for Sweden, and America may get the RQ-2 or the Northrop Grumman Bat, again just to give them something unique, with a top speed right in the middle of all of these at 167 km per hour. France might be a little difficult because their main quote-unquote small UAV is the Israeli RQ-5 Hunter, which is 2 or 3 times the size of any of the others we've brought up here, or more. And China, on the other hand, have by far the most options, way too many to go over, so I'm sure Gaijin will find something to fit within these ranges. Again, at the moment, a lot of this is just unknown. Will we even get different drones for all these nations, or just blanket drones, say for Russia, for China, and then one just for NATO/the West in general, regardless of who actually used it, similar to the way nuclear bombers work, with America, even though they have the F-105 now, still using the Jaguar to drop nukes at top tier. So far, we only know of the Zala for Russia, so for things like your BMPs, Sprit SDs, etc. Hopefully we'll see more soon, or on the dev server. The second kind of drone is the UCAV, for Unmanned Combat Aerial Vehicle, otherwise known as a strike drone, the main example of course being the very famous MQ-1 Predator drone. Now these won't be modifications, they won't be tied to a particular vehicle or vehicle class, nor will they be researchable like tech tree aircraft. Instead, they'll simply be added to your lineups from a certain BR point, just like nuclear bombers. 3 types of UCAVs will be coming to the game this update, the Orion for Russia, the Winglong 1 for China, and then the MQ-1 being a drone that goes to all other nations, even though the only other nation in game to actually use it, besides the US in real life, is Italy. These drones will have the ability to carry anti-tank missiles such as the MQ-1 Predator carrying 2 Hellfires, while the Winglong 1 I believe is capable of carrying the same BA-9 anti-tank missiles from the new Chinese helicopter. Unlike the recon drones, these will cost spawn points to spawn in, acting just like an aircraft that can't be pilot sniped, though again perhaps you can do the equivalent by shooting out their receiver and transmitter equipment. And Gaijin says that these will only be available to spawn in RB mode, at least upon this update. What these are, what the idea of them is to give even players who've not researched or bought any higher tier aircraft or helicopters, only researching the tank tech tree, access to some close air support, which is actually shockingly benevolent from Gaijin, who could just as easily have said, we have premiums available, just pay up if you don't want to be stuck with your ineffective low tier props in top tier ground battles. Perhaps because some form of close air support will now be available to everyone, even those who've only researched tanks, Gaijin might see a drop in sales of premium attack jets like Su-7 BMKs or Milans, though keep in mind those aircraft will be much more effective than these drones overall. These drones, again, are much slower than even props, topping out somewhere below 280 kph, and as of right now, only carrying a max of 2 air-to-ground weapons, though the MQ-1 can carry up to 4 Stinger air-to-air missiles, so perhaps you'll be able to load 2 Stingers and 1 Hellfire if you really wanted to. Now the Wingling 1 and Orion 2, I believe, also have the ability to drop guided bombs, so we may see that in game, but Gaijin doesn't mention it. As for whether they'll be able to capture bases, since they have incredibly low stall speeds and all have landing gear to be able to do it and take back off again in theory, this is as of yet unknown. Now this is all very interesting, because the idea of super slow fixed-wing aircraft at the higher BRs has always been a contentious point. I remember a ton of people saying that the A-10 could never work in game, and that I was a complete moron for even suggesting it could, because it's too slow. Aged like a fine milk. And these drones are far slower again, but with ordnance like Hellfires. That kind of casts aspersions on what I said in this video about an aircraft like the OV-10 Bronco not working in game, as that aircraft is both faster, can carry more Hellfires as well as Sidewinders, at least in the OV-10D variant, while also having guns, though where it would fit in the tech tree, I have no idea. Effectively, these are minimally armed helicopters that can hover, that everyone in top tier will be able to access, regardless of what your aviation or helicopter tree looks like, and even if you're a free-to-play player. They'll have targeting views like helicopters or aircraft with guided ordnance like Mavericks or Paveways, as well as all three, I believe, having forward-looking infrared systems or thermal optics. Probably the most major question I have, however, is whether or not these drones will earn the user research points in Silver Lions, and if they do, where do those research points go? If I'm using the MQ-1 Predator for, say, Italy, can I be researching my Italian jets with it? Or is all that RP I would have earned using a traditional aircraft just going into the ether? Also, will I be able to rearm and repair a drone? Can I do it on helibases like VTOL jets are able to, or do I have to travel all the way back to the main runway at 200 km per hour, just like a regular aircraft? If so, it's not really worthwhile. Now I want to make a video specifically about future strike drones that might come to the game, if Gaijin want to make them more like a vehicle type that gets continually upgraded as you go into higher and higher BR battles, where you have access to a different drone at 9.7 than you do at 9.0, or 10.3 or 11.3, etc. With things like jet-powered drones that are faster and can carry more. But that brings us on to one of the most major issues I have with this edition, and that is how low in the BRs you'll actually be able to start seeing these. Gaijin state with the Recon UAVs, you'll start having them as researchable modules in all rank 6 and 7 light tanks, which means as early as 8.0 with light tanks like the Sheridan or M41D, wheeled light tanks like the AMX-10 RC, or IFVs like the Warrior or Bradley, in turn potentially going into 7.0 battles. Not only are there already an insane amount of light tanks being played at these BRs, meaning quite probably swarms of these drones flying around at all times, while their light tank motherships just sit still half the game, which does not sound enjoyable at all, but they'll be fighting World War II heavy tanks like the T-29 and IS-3, hell, even the T-95 Doom Turtle. This is already where we see the biggest jump in capability, at least in my opinion, of all War Thunder ground forces. The difference between 5.7 and 6.7 is challenging, but they're still overall the same types of vehicles. The difference between 10.0 and 11.0 is definitely way too great, but the difference between 7.0 and 8.0 is so far apart that 7.0s are usually rendered completely redundant as the new doctrine of warfare takes over, and they have to rely completely on luck and ambush tactics. Imagine then that these speedy light tanks with 600mm penetrating ATGMs or APFSDS rounds, stabilized guns, thermal optics, etc. also know exactly where all those enemies are, which direction they're facing, whether or not they're damaged or their cannon is damaged, how many friendlies are around them, and just generally what their plan is. All of a sudden, these 7.0 vehicles like Conway or Ho-Ri tank destroyers and IS-3 or T-29 heavies can't even rely on cheap ambushes anymore. They basically become completely useless. When it comes to the strike drones or UCAVs, this becomes even more illogical. If 8.0 lineups are now equipped with Hellfire capability, we're going to have a massive problem. It doesn't matter how slow the launch platform is when it can launch Hellfires from more than twice the effective range of any SPAA it can face. The likes of Shilka or Sidam or even Gepard just cannot do anything against an MQ-1. In this case, I would suggest that Gaijin only introduced UCAVs to rank 7 initially, possibly introducing them lower down, but only based on battle rating, not rank. These drones should absolutely never be seen below 9.0, which already makes them extremely powerful in a down tier, even though they only have a couple of these missiles. Which brings me on to the next point of how many spawn points will these things cost? Will they be cheaper than regular aircraft? And if so, just how common are they likely to be on a battlefield? There's a reason helicopters don't get any Hellfires until 10.0 with the British Lynx, and everyone else at 10.3. Even though you've only got 2 of them and on a very slow platform, you will be able to rack up huge numbers of very easy kills by just being able to outrange every SPAA vehicle you go up against in a down tier. So really, besides the M247 and the Chrysanthema, there'll be absolutely nothing that can handle these until you start seeing optically guided SAMs like the Roland. So ideally, I'd even say that 9.3 should be the absolute lowest battle rating these drones should be present at. And kind of like the nukes, if you're playing an 8.3 to 9.3 game, they show up for you even if you're only using an 8.3 lineup, while an 8.0 to 9.0 game won't show them for anybody. When it comes to the recon drones though, it's a bit more difficult to handle, especially with so much still unknown. This is stuff we'll have to hope we get answered on a dev server or at least a dev stream, though if I do get some answers from my contacts at Gaijin, I will be sure to pin a comment down below. Basically, what I'd suggest though is lowering some of the earliest rank 6 light tanks back down into rank 5, keeping their BRs the same, but in the case of the Sheridan, M41D and possibly the AMX-13 Hot, Mars 15 and AMX-10 RC, putting them back into rank 5, whilst taking literally every other light tank in the game, at least at rank 6 and 7, and raising it up in BR by at least 1 spot, to reflect this new capability. Again, imagine you're playing a game of chess or something, and you know exactly what the opponent is trying to do. Imagine you're playing a game of poker, and you can see the opposition's hand. It's an enormous advantage for anyone smart enough to use it. The other option, and these two definitely work best together, is to define a whole new kind of vehicle, one dedicated to the reconnaissance role, and give them the recon drones rather than giving them to combat-focused light tanks like the VFM-5, Mars 15, TAM, Cuirassier, which should actually be a tank destroyer, the XM-8, Sprut SDs, and other vehicles like that. The only problem there is, where do you draw the line? Does the HSTVL count? What about the Striker MGS, which is designed as an assault gun? Presumably it'll be the only vehicle like that which doesn't count as a recon vehicle, the Centauro, Type 16, etc. all are. Though Gaijin could always fudge the classification a bit to make it fair, just as they have for things like the M18 Hellcat or the aforementioned Cuirassier. What this separation does, however, is lower the average number of vehicles on the battlefield which have the capability of launching recon drones, meaning fewer of them buzzing around, fewer tanks just sitting still waiting for someone else to push out, knowing where that player is so they can kill them. Again, that does not sound fun. But it also means less scouting actually happening, less chance that players are just competing with each other to scout the enemy tank before someone else kills them, instead of actually killing them themselves, and less chance of RB at top tier just turning into arcade, where everyone is spotted all the time. And when I brought up these suggestions to the developers, both lowering the earliest rank 6 light tanks back into rank 5, raising the others above the 8.0 range, and or defining a new vehicle class to give the drones to, they told me that they are being considered and changes along these lines will likely be made in future. These kinds of things will need to be tested on dev servers though, of course, so I'm hoping for one this coming weekend. The last thing I want to raise is the potential for things like VTOL UAVs, helicopter drones like the American MQ-8. These are just the helicopter equivalents of things like the RQ-2 or Zala. In fact, there is actually a Zala UAV helicopter as well. By the way, future Koala here, just appending this onto the end of the video, I've been told by Gaijin staff, Gaijin developers, that none of the recon drones being added, this patch at least, have any landing gear. So that means no RQ-2 or RQ-7, and thus they won't be able to capture bases. But that these are considered for the future, as are helicopter UAVs as well. There are also suicide drones like the Israeli Harpy or American Switchblade series, very famous given their use right now in the Ukraine conflict. These should absolutely not come as modifications for light tanks, as they basically act like non-line of sight ATGMs, where a tank could sit on a friendly cap, launch unlimited suicide drones, and wipe out a whole enemy team without ever being visible. There also most likely just aren't enough of them to make an appearance in any regard, Israel and America being the only two nations in game to use them to my knowledge. And when I brought it up to Gaijin, they just said a flat out no, they're not even under consideration, but I did for completionist's sake just want to bring them up here. Perhaps the recon UAVs will be able to kamikaze into any open-topped vehicles or exposed crew members like the M113 TOWs, the UDES-33, or the occasional BTR-ZD, but that's about as close as we're likely to get. Oh, and apparently a bunch of you guys are planning on using these things to kamikaze into helicopters' rotors to take them down, which might actually work for some of the lower BR helicopters that aren't so fast or so far from the battlefield. But that then makes me wonder whether heli-base AA will actually shoot at the drones, as that'll let the attack helicopter pilots know they're coming, and I feel like these things won't be too difficult to take down. A single 7.62mm round to the wings should do it. There's also, though I brought up the importance of not giving these recon drones to too many different tanks, the potential for some other vehicle types to get them, like SPAAs or even certain tank destroyers. That would give them something to do while they're not in use. Particularly, I'm thinking of vehicles like the Type 93 or ITO in Flarakrad. These are SPAAs that still get the scouting ability, and so potentially could have scouting drones. Now this would be especially good for Israel, who, while I brought up the Orbiter UAV they could get, don't actually have any light tanks to get it right now, unless there's one for this update that's yet to be seen. As I said, we'll do a dedicated video on the potential of UCAVs that could be added in future, along with maybe some more recon drones too, depending on which of them we actually get come the update. But for now, that is basically all I have to say, so let me know down in the comments, what do you think? Are you excited to try and fly out some of these little super nimble machines? Remember, drones don't have pilots that black out at high Gs. Are you concerned about what it will do to the game in general, or whether they'll be imbalanced? Remember, right now at least, Israel do not have a single vehicle that can launch a recon drone. At all. Now I know a lot of you who just hate CAS in general will probably not like that there's now the potential for even more of it. But remember that this will allow you basically a free crew slot to use it, meaning that you could line up more ground vehicles to bring in, perhaps an extra SPAA, while still having some close air support to use even if you don't dedicate any of your own crew slots to it. Basically, you replace whatever plane or helicopter you're currently using with a tank, and you'll still have some air-launched Hellfire capability to help you when you need to take out some campers or some long-range tank destroyers. Now my overall opinion is that if the potential problems I've raised here are accounted for, then UAVs have the potential to really help some people out and to be really enjoyable. I loved using them in last year's April Fools, for instance. They'll add a new element to gameplay, which is something War Thunder could really use to help break up the monotony of doing the same things we've been doing for years for old guards like me. However, if 8.0 light tanks can launch recon drones that can fly around and scout a whole team of enemy 7.0 to 8.0 vehicles, and potentially even have access to Hellfires, then the 7.0 to 8.7 range of the game is going to be in some really significant trouble. Again, we just need to wait for some of those answers. Anyway, I really hope you have enjoyed this video. It's been a lot longer than I expected it to be. This is, like I said, a positively very significant change that will come to the game. But if you did enjoy, please remember to leave a like and subscribe, leave your thoughts down below, and as always, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll catch you in the skies, on the battlefield? I don't know, keep an eye out for me. Bye. But around the end of 2021, various Russian tanks, predominantly the T-72B and B-3, started to be spotted with the big rooftop cages sitting above the turret, and initial reports supposed that these were a measure to defeat top attack ATGMs. Now, if you're not familiar with the concept of a top attack missile, you've almost certainly heard of them, with Ukraine fielding a bunch of them against the invading Russian army, consisting particularly of the Swedish In-Law and the American Javelin.